This program is brought to you by the National Association of Insurance and Financial Advisors, promoting political advocacy, education, and the ethical conduct of its members nationwide.
Hi, I'm Bill Whitley, author of 8 Secrets of the Top Performing Agents, and welcome to another NAFA program in a box. So I'd like to share with you a little bit about how this research came about. 4 years ago, I wrote a book called Art of the Rainmaker. And Art of the Rainmaker teaches one very simple thing. It teaches financial advisors how to create a client attraction story. A client attraction story is not a made-up story. It's a real-world story. And it helps you position yourself as an advisor and then really demonstrate that you can indeed do what you said you could do. So I had a large insurance agency. Somebody at the agency read my book, and I was invited to go to Los Angeles and do a sales seminar for 250 agents. And about a month before the seminar, they said a fascinating thing to me. The person who hired me to do the seminar said, "You know, Bill, a typical agent here in the LA market area writes about 15 raw new autos a month. And our top agencies in the state of California consistently write 70 new auto policies a month. And they said, your job is to help the typical agency increase production." And then he whispered to me, he said, "You know, by the way, most of our agencies are never going to make it to 70, and we're not worried about that. If you could help the typical agency go from 15 to 20, it'd be a big victory." And I said, "Well, if that's the case, could I interview your top 10 agents? You know, can I find out how they do what they do?" And he said, "Sure." And he teed up 10 interviews. Well, I called every single agent on the phone, and at the end of my interviews, I was just blown away with what I learned. And I was so excited that I created a seminar called 8 Secrets of the Top Performing Agents. When I interviewed these top agencies, what I was looking for was, how do they position themselves? How do they differentiate themselves? How do they communicate their value? How do they create lifelong relationships? In other words, what do the top agencies say? What are the words they use? What are the stories they tell? The questions they ask? How do they do a needs analysis and discover and make everyday risks simple and visual and easy to understand? One of the interesting things I noticed about the top performing agencies is that they've all made a fundamental transition. They have gone from quoting home and auto to advising clients in the most holistic way possible, how to protect their income, how to protect their assets, how to protect their family. The second thing that blew me away about these agencies was they were so consistent, so concise, they were so well practiced. And when I said, "What's the big deal about being well practiced?" they said, "Well, you know, when you're well practiced, you never stumble, you never freeze, you never panic." So I'm excited about sharing some of the conversations with you today that I recommend that you practice and get really consistent with. I want to share with you, we don't have time to do all 8 secrets, but I'm going to squeeze in as much as I possibly can, and all along the way I'll show you how you can take this back to your team and have access to all 8 secrets. So let's get started. Secret number 1. Early in the conversation, the top performing agents position themselves as someone who can help manage everyday risk. And a lot of people say, you know, what do you mean? Early in the conversation, they position themselves. And so I always like to use an example. So let's suppose I had somebody named Doug called me. I'm an agent, and Doug says, "Hey, Bill, I want an auto quote." What Doug's really saying is, Bill, I've seen all the ads, yours and everybody else's, and I want to save money on my auto insurance. And the typical agency says, sure, Doug, I'll be happy to get you a quote. What kind of car do you have? And that's all they do. They're quoters. Your top agencies are very different. The top agencies say, sure, Doug, I'd be delighted to help you out with that. Let me ask you a few questions. And the number one question these top agencies ask is so simple. So, Doug, how did you hear about us? And to the decimal point, your top agencies can tell you exactly what made the phone ring. They spend their marketing money on things that make the phone ring. They don't spend their marketing on anything that won't make the phone ring. Question number 2. So, Doug, how many cars do you own? And Doug says, well, you know, I'm married and my wife and I both own a car. I say, great, Doug. Third question, do you and your wife own your home? And he says, yeah, we own our home. Last question, Doug, do you and your wife make investments? Now, about the time I ask question number 4, Doug says, Bill, come on, man. All I want to do is save a little money on my auto insurance. I don't know why you're probing around with all of that. And the top agencies all said this differently, but the gist of what every single one of them said was, Doug, here's the deal. If the only thing you want is cheap auto insurance, you could probably get it cheaper from somebody else. But I can tell you and your wife have been successful. You've accumulated some wealth. If you'd like me to take a look at everything you own and recommend the most effective way to protect it, then I'm your guy. And by the way, if I write multiple lines for you, if I insure both of your cars and your home and a personal umbrella, I'm allowed to offer you a multi-line discount. So ultimately, I'll save you money on your auto insurance, but you need to think of me as someone who can help you manage your everyday risk. And then they asked this one powerful question. They said, is that of interest to you? Now, I went through that real quickly, but I'd like to go back through those questions and those comments and share just a little bit more insight into why those questions are being asked and those positioning comments. The first question, how did you hear about us? And they wouldn't let anyone come in or call in without understanding that important reason. And if you know why they're coming in, it allows you to invest more wisely your marketing dollars. Question 2, how many cars do you own? Question 3, do you own your home? And the all-important question number 4, do you make investments or do you have investments? Now, some of the agencies that I talk to don't like question number 4. They'd rather stay in their cozy little home and auto box. Your top agencies wanted to ask question 4. They wanted to ask something that was bigger than just home and auto. And when that prospect pushed back and said, hey, all I want to do is save a little money on my auto insurance, why are you asking about all of that? It gave them permission to position themselves as so much more than just home and auto. So once Doug pushed back and said, why are you asking about that? There was 5 key comments. Comment number 1, if the only thing you want is cheap auto insurance, you could probably get it cheaper from somebody else. Comment number 2, but I can tell you and your wife have been successful. Comment number 3, if you'd like me to take a look at everything you own and recommend the most effective way to protect it, then I'm your guy. And by the way, if I write multiple lines for you, both of your cars and your home, I'm allowed to offer you a multi-line discount. So ultimately, I'll save you money on your auto insurance. But you need to think of me as somebody who can help you manage your everyday risk. And then they ask that one powerful question, is that of interest to you? I'm pleased to report to you that at the end of my seminar, several years ago, an AFE named Ron Patterson, an agency field executive named Ron Patterson, walked up and said, I can't believe how easy you made that seminar. And the guy who hired me to come out was named Jim Barr. And he called me several days later and said, Bill, you won't believe this. I'm getting calls from agents who are no longer just quoting. They're asking better questions. They're positioning themselves early in the conversation as someone who can help manage everyday risk. They tell me they're not only closing more autos, they're writing more lines per customer. And so that seminar was a huge victory, and I've now been invited to deliver it all across the country. So the first, I mentioned that I'm going to share some of the conversations and comments and questions your top agencies share. The first conversation that I suggest you master are your opening questions and your positioning comments. Now, I'm going to squeeze as much information into this program as I possibly can. There's a lot of people at the end of my program come up and say, Bill, that's so simple, so powerful. I can't believe I'm not doing that already. So if you like these ideas and you want to really master them, if you want to take them back to your agency, go to my website, www.billwhittley.com. I've created something called a team training kit. It includes a 148-page hardbound copy of my book. It has every question, every story, every comment I'm going to share with you today, and much more is in my book. I also have an audio CD if you'd like to hear the entire 3-hour CD. A lot of the agents I talk to say, listen, I have a fair amount of windshield time, and I'd like to put this in and listen to it over and over as I'm driving around. It includes an audio CD set. It also includes a DVD with 8 short summary videos. It's perfect to show to your team during a staff meeting. I've also created something called a flip book, and the team training kit includes 4 flip books. The flip book has it summarizes the main concepts from this seminar so that your team can put that on their desk and remind themselves every day. So I'm going to give you as much as I can in this hour, but I want you to know there's plenty of resources if you want to really master this and take it into your agency. And with that, let's go to secret number 2. Secret number 2 is that the top performing agents and their team members consistently share the right stories. And before I dive into this secret, let me share the rest of my story. Right after I had my big victory, when I delivered the seminar the first time out in Los Angeles, I called the guy that I used to work for. His name is Stan Viner. Stan is the national sales manager for Jack Henry and Associates. Jack Henry sells technology to banks. They have 250 sales reps. They have a big sales meeting every July, and they bring in outside speakers. So I called Stan in November, and I said, Stan, I just had this amazing victory with a big insurance company. I got to tell you all about it. Stan called me back a couple days later, and he said, yeah, what'd you do? And I told Stan the exact story that I told you at the beginning of this seminar. I told him about being hired to go out and deliver a seminar for 250 agents, and that I was allowed to interview their top producers, and I was just blown away with what I learned. And I developed a seminar called 8 Secrets of the Top Performing Agents, and I said, Stan, would you like to hear secret number 1? And of course he wanted to hear secret number 1. And at the end of this little 5-minute phone conversation, Stan Viner said, Bill, let me get this straight. You interviewed their top producers. You looked for commonality. You synthesized what the top producers do. And then you created a seminar and you taught 250 agents how to do what the top 10 do. I said, that's exactly right. Stan said, Bill, there's no sales manager in America who wouldn't want that. He said, to be honest with you, I don't want to wait till July. He said, I have 2 regional meetings coming up. One's in Dallas, one's in Orlando. He said, unfortunately, we've already picked out the speaker we were going to bring in. He said, but we haven't signed his contract yet. He said, I think it's not too late for us to boot him out and put you in. He said, I'll call you back in a couple of days. 2 days later, Stan Viner called back and said, he's out, you're in. And to me, that's the power of a story. That's the power of being able to share an example of how I helped a customer just like you that had a problem just like yours, and they got great results. So my motto is, if you know how to open, you don't have to close. And I would much rather open than close. Opening is all about how I can help you. Closing is about me trying to put you in a box and get you to do what I want you to do. So I'd much rather open than close, and for me, the most powerful way to open is with a well-crafted example of how I helped a customer just like you with a problem just like yours. It's interesting, when I talk to salespeople, most salespeople, when I ask them what they do, they quickly tell me about their products and their services. When I interviewed these top agencies, the top agencies, instead of talking about insurance, the top performing agents shared stories about clients who avoided difficulty because they had the right insurance. I call these client attraction stories. They follow a simple formula. A client attraction story is a real-world story. This is not a made-up story. It's a real-world story about a client that had a challenge where your insight or advice helped them avoid difficulty or achieve a goal, and they got great results. So let me share an example of what one of these stories sounds like. One of the agents that I interviewed was an agent named Mike Williamson, and I asked all the agents the same questions. One of the questions was, could you give me an example of a customer that had a challenge, but because of your advice or insight, they avoided difficulty? And Mike said, sure. He said, you know, Bill, one of my clients is a college professor. He's a nice guy. He's a smart guy. He was driving home from work one day, and it started to rain, and he pulled up to a stoplight, and he was going to make a right on red. And so he looks left. There's no oncoming traffic. And he said just when he was making his right turn, there was a guy running across the intersection trying to get himself out of the rain. And he said, my client never saw him, and he hit him with his car. And he said $900,000 later, the last medical bill was paid. And he said, fortunately, 1 year before that accident, my client bought a $1 million personal umbrella policy from me. He said, there's not a time that he sees me that he didn't come up and thank me for selling him that policy. And he said, by the way, had he not bought that policy, a typical chain of events would have occurred. You know, first, he would have exhausted all of his savings trying to pay off that guy's medical bills. And he said, I know what he's got. He doesn't have $900,000. So when he exhausted all of his savings, he would have started going into debt. And when the debt burden got too great, he would have declared bankruptcy. But because he had that one policy in place, there was no financial impact at all. So my message that day, 4 years ago in Los Angeles, was, you don't have to know how to sell personal umbrella. Your staff doesn't have to know how to sell personal umbrella. All they really have to know how to do is share that one story. And I said, you know, today I'd go share that story with my staff, and tomorrow I'd ask my staff to share that story back with me. I'd think about that story like it's my most powerful asset, my most powerful sales tool. So let me tell you just a little bit more of this story and how powerful these stories are as educational tools for your clients. I was hired to do a workshop for team members down in South Haven, Mississippi. One of the team members, the agent staff that was at the workshop, was named Brandy Bell. The day after the workshop, I got this email from Deb, who's the person who hired me to come down to South Haven, Mississippi. And Brandy had emailed Deb, and Deb forwarded it to me. Brandy said, Deb, thanks for having Bill come to our AFO. I really liked his seminar. She said, I timidly tried out the professor story after a guy called in this morning and wanted a quote on homeowners. He said we were the last ones he was going to call. He said his existing insurance company had gone up $600 a year and he had no claims. And I said, well, is price the most important thing to you? And he said, at this point, yes. And we talked, and I told him, we're a little different from other companies. We help clients manage their everyday risk. And he said, what's that mean? And I shared the professor example. You know, I shared an example of what a good risk manager does. And he said, well, how much does that cost? And I quoted him an umbrella. And he said, wow, when you insure my home, I want to go ahead and get that too. I wanted to fly down to South Haven, Mississippi and hug Brandy Bell. In 24 hours, she had started making the shift from quoter to advisor. She had positioned herself as somebody who could help manage everyday risk, and then she shared an example of what a good risk manager does. She didn't need 4 questions. She didn't need 5 positioning comments. Brandy Bell did it with 14 words. We're a little different from other insurance companies. We help clients manage their everyday risk. Nobody knows what everyday risk is, so the only possible response is, what's that mean? And when he said, what's that mean, Brandy had the courage to share a 30-second example of what a good risk manager does. And she transitioned a single-line, price-driven quote that her agent would have lost and transitioned it into a multi-line relationship that they won. And she did it with 14 words. And now you know why I say these top agencies are so well practiced. And now you know why I recommend that you practice these conversations, that you share them with your staff and practice them and get really comfortable with some of these comments and questions and stories. So right after we talk about Brandy Bell and how she transitioned a single-line, price-driven quote that her agency would have lost into a multi-line relationship that they won. So let me share with you a little bit more about the psychology of how these stories work. I call this Storytelling 101. There's 5 interesting things that happen in the human mind when you hear a story. The first thing that happens is we're entertained. We have all loved stories since we were children. And if you have the power to entertain, that means you can now attract and hold attention. In this fast-paced age of voicemail, texting, nobody has any time. If you have the ability to attract and hold attention, you have one of the rarest commodities of them all. When you become a good storyteller, you now have that power. The second interesting thing that happens is these stories create credibility. Actually, it's the details in your stories that establish instant credibility. When I'm working with agents and team members to develop their client attraction stories, one of the things I see them do, they tend to truncate their story. They tell it in the shortest possible format. I want to encourage you to put a few details into your story. The details give you instant credibility. Now, do not create a shaggy dog story. Nobody wants you to waste their time. So don't put any detail in the story that doesn't have to be there. But I encourage you to think through some of the details and include those in your story. The third fascinating thing about these stories, they create something known as a vicarious experience, and that's the power to change perception, to change belief. The best teacher is an experience. You've heard the old saying, a lesson learned the hard way is learned the right way. If you touch the hot stove and you burn your finger, it hurts, and never touch the hot stove. So an experience is the best teacher. Well, when you share a story, it's now been proven that it approximates 95% of the original experience. So when Brandy Bell shares that story about the college professor, 95% of that college professor's experience is being transferred to that prospect. Fourth, these stories have the power to reduce cynicism. And that means your prospect no longer has to find flaws with your presentation. If Doug is trying to convince me to buy life insurance and I'm not ready to buy, I'm no longer really listening to his presentation. I'm trying to find a flaw with it. Because sooner or later, Doug's going to say, well, Bill, are you ready to sign up? And I want to make sure I've got a good objection. And if he overcomes that first objection, I want to make sure to hit him with a second objection. So what I'm really trying to do is find a reason not to buy. I'm becoming a cynic. When you share a story, there is no reason to find a flaw with the story. Mike Williamson's client is a college professor. He's a nice guy, a smart guy. He was driving home from work and it started to rain. When he made his right turn, he never saw the guy. It's just what happened. So when you share a story, there is no reason to find a flaw with it. And fifth is consistency. These stories are very easy to tell and they're easy to retell. So once you develop that story well with all the right details, now you can practice it and get really good at it, really comfortable with it. You can share it with your staff and help them use it as the same exact asset that it is for you. So the next question is, how are the most effective stories organized? And that's storytelling 202. And I want to go on record as saying, I don't want you to make anything up. I don't want you to say anything that's not true. The truth will set you free. But I would like to suggest the most effective way to organize your story so that it has the greatest impact, the greatest educational value for your client. The best stories all follow something we call the hero's journey. And you've known the hero's journey since you were a child and you heard your first good bedtime story. It sounded something like this. Once upon a time, there was a hero who had reason to go on an adventure where he, she, or it met a huge challenge to which there was a hero-inspired way out, and he, she, or it returned home safely. That is the classic plot element. It's in every book you read. It's in every movie you watch. And I recommend that you follow that simple format as you develop your client attraction story. Now, in a client attraction story, this is business, right? This is real world, real examples. It's not a fairy tale. So the very first part of that story is called background. Introduce us to the client. By the way, your client is the hero of the story. You are not the hero. The client is the hero. So introduce us to the client and give us just a little bit of background. Mike Williamson did it perfectly. He said, I have a client who's a college professor. Nice guy, smart guy. And with that, we had a glimpse of exactly who that hero is, who that client is. I hear a lot of insurance agents say, I have an insured. I have an insured that was driving home. Well, who is an insured? Are they male or female? Are they young or old? And what do they do? So I would recommend you replace the word insured by giving us a little glimpse of who that client really is. Mike Williamson did it perfectly. I have a client who's a college professor, nice guy, smart guy. It took him just a few seconds to introduce us to the hero. The next part of your client attraction story is called journey. Journey is simply the client's goal. It's what they want to achieve. Third is obstacle. Client encountered some obstacle, and in Mike Williamson's college professor, he said, he pulled up to a stoplight, he was going to make a right on red, and he looked left, and when he made his right turn, he never saw the guy, and he hit him with his car. $900,000 later, the last medical bill was paid. It's a great example of a challenge. And then solution, he said, fortunately, 1 year before that accident, my client bought a $1 million personal umbrella policy from me, and he said, there's not a time that he sees me that he doesn't come up and thank me for selling him that policy. And then finally, his results. Thanks to the solution you helped the client implement, life for the client has changed. And he said, by the way, had he not bought that policy, a typical chain of events would have occurred. First, he would have exhausted all of his savings trying to pay off that guy's medical bills. Then he would have gone into debt. Then he would have declared bankruptcy. But because he had that one policy in place, there was no financial impact at all. Next question I get asked is, where do the best stories come from? Where do I find them? I would recommend you look for them in 3 places. The first place to look is a client experience. Mike Williamson's story is a classic client experience story. You know, one of my clients is a college professor, nice guy, smart guy. The second place to look is a personal experience. Now, a personal experience, if you have one of these, I call it a raison d'être story. It's a French word that means reason for being. Your staff are sitting on tons of these stories. One of the best personal stories I ever heard came from a brand new agent. She's in California. Her name is Angela Frangia. And I said, Angela, tell me, congratulations, you're one of the best. How do you do it? And Angela said, Bill, when I meet with a client, I always ask a simple question. I say, can I share a little bit of my personal background with you so you'll understand how I approach risk management? And she said, the client always says, sure. And she said, when they say sure, I said, well, my parents came to this country from another country. They came here to live the American dream. And my dad opened up a neighborhood grocery store. And he had a hard time getting timely shipments from the big grocery store supplier. And he talked to some other local grocery store owners. They had the same problem. And so my dad opened up a wholesale grocery distribution warehouse. And she said business took off. And 3 years later, he opened a second wholesale grocery distribution warehouse. She said, we were living the American dream. And she said, in warehouse number 2, there's a set of tracks, and they use these tracks to move stuff back and forth. And we owned a forklift, and the forklift had gotten stuck on the tracks. And my dad went to get it off the tracks. And he ended up tipping the forklift over, and it fell on top of him, and it crushed him and killed him. And she said, I was 16, and my mom didn't speak a word of English. So she had me start writing all the checks to pay our bills. And we didn't have enough money coming in. I said, Mom, what are we going to do? How are we going to pay our bills? And she said, don't worry, Daddy had a life policy. Everything's going to be okay. And she said, a couple of weeks later, we got a life check for $250,000. And she said, by the way, when you get a life check, you get all $250,000. They don't even take the taxes out. She said, my mom's a very savvy lady. We live in San Jose, and she used the money. She bought some small retail office complexes. She also bought a life policy for me and my little brother, Davy. She said, fast forward 15 years. She said, I married a systems engineer. Nice guy, smart guy, good career. But to supplement his career, she said, I opened up a deli in one of my mom's retail office buildings. A very successful 5,000 square foot deli. We served 250 lunches a day. She said, fast forward another 10 years. She said, my mom came to work for me, and my little brother Davy came to work for me. She said one day he showed up and he had this stomach ache, and he'd been taking all these antacids for it. And she said a week later, we had to take him to the hospital. It turned out he had a malignant stomach tumor. And she said, once they got him admitted, I went to check in on Davy, and he looked at me and said, Angela, what am I going to do? If something happens to me, what's going to happen to my wife and my kids? And she said, I went home, and I said, Mom, when we were little kids, didn't you buy us a life policy? And she said, yeah, I bought one for you and one for Davy. And she said, well, how much did you buy? She said, I bought $1 million for you, $1 million for Davy. She said, Mom, you got to tell him. He's terrified. He's so worried that something's going to happen to him. You got to tell him. And she said, I know he's terrified. I know he's fighting for his life. And I don't want to tell him. I'm afraid he'll die. Well, they told him. And 3 weeks later, Davy died. And a few weeks after that, Davy's wife and 4 children got a check for $1 million. And she said, without it, life would have been a nightmare. And she said, when my dad died, we got a check for $250,000, and without it, life would have been a nightmare. And she said, now you know why I do what I do. She said, it gives me great joy to provide you with the very same thing that saved me and my family and my brother and his family. And you need to know that I'm going to do everything I can do to protect you. Is that okay with you? Now that story comes from a very deep place inside Angela Frangilla. It is her raison d'etre. It is why, even as a brand new agent, she became one of the very best. So the first place to look for a story is a client experience. The second place to look for your story is a personal experience. One of the staff members that was in my workshop one time said, "You know, Bill, my dad hung ceiling tile. And he was up on the stilts those guys used to put the tiles in place, and he was backing up, and there was a stack of drywall. He didn't see it, and he fell over backwards, and he broke his back. And he was disabled, and he couldn't work anymore. And he thought the contractor that he worked for had disability, but he didn't. And so my dad couldn't work, and we had no income. And my grandmother lived with us, and she had all these beautiful antiques, and she would always say, 'You know, Susan, something happens to me, you get that real pretty armoire, and your sister's going to get that beautiful secretary.' She said, 'I never got any of those antiques. We had to sell them all just to pay the bills.' And I said, 'Susan, the only thing I would add to that story is at the end of the story, I would just simply say to your customer, I don't want the same thing to happen to you.' And so that's what a good risk manager does. It's their job to understand your complete situation and then recommend the most holistic way for you to protect yourself and your income and your assets and your family." One other interesting story about these stories is I got a call one time from a lady named Katie Folletti. Katie's in learning and development for a large insurance company, for the original company that hired me to do the seminar back in LA. And Katie said, "Bill, there's a vice president of our agency who's considering having you come in and do a keynote speech at a big sales conference, and he's asked me to interview you and understand your content and make sure that it would fit within our program." So I shared secret number one, and Katie loved secret number one. Then I shared secret number two, and I shared Mike Williamson's college professor story. At the end of that story, most people go, "Wow, that's a great story." But Katie said, "Oh my gosh." And I said, what's wrong? And Katie said, "Well, I just realized that I don't have a personal umbrella." She said, "I'm calling my agent today and getting a personal umbrella policy." And I said, "You tell him he owes me a commission." Now, my only point is that Katie Folletti works in learning and development at a very large insurance carrier. And she never understood the value of a personal umbrella policy until she heard that one story. And I'm simply suggesting that some of your clients may not understand the value of your products or the value of your advice and insight until they hear one client attraction story. So the second conversation that I hope you'll master is your client attraction stories. One of the things I recommend is that you actually create a story asset. A lot of people say, yeah, I love stories. I got them. I share them all the time. And some people say, I'm not really good at sharing stories. So let me give you 5 simple steps you can do if you'd like to create a story asset and make it really powerful, you and for your staff. 5 simple steps you can do. First, write your story down. That's going to become the baseline of your story. Next, if possible, go share your story with the insured. It would be brilliant if Mike Williamson could go to that college professor and say, I now share your story as an example of why people ought to have a personal umbrella. I never mention your name, but I share your story. And I just wonder, could I share the story with you? I want to make sure I'm telling it accurately. Now, what you're really listening for are the quotes that came out of that college professor's mouth, the thoughts when he hit the guy. Did he think his life was over? When he was served with the $1 million lawsuit, did he think he was financially devastated? When his insurance carrier hired the attorneys and mounted the defense and settled the suit, was he overjoyed? What were the thoughts and the comments in that college professor's mind? And I encourage you to weave those into the story. The details of your story are what give it instant credibility. Fourth, practice your story. It takes me about 10 times of sharing a story before I get really good. And fifth, share the story with your team and with your prospects. One last thing about these stories, and then we're going to move on to the next secret, which is some of the conversations your top agencies have. And that is that I believe I'm in a lifeboat. And I've got life jackets. And my prospects are in the water, and I am throwing them life jackets as fast as I can. Some of them will take a life jacket. Some of them won't. To be honest with you, I don't feel rejected if you won't take my life jacket. I kind of feel sorry for you. So here's what happens with a client attraction story. Every time you share it, it reminds you of your value. Every time Mike Williamson shares that story, he's reminded of the fact that he saved that college professor from financial devastation. And it builds your self-belief. And this thing wells up inside of you that I call authentic enthusiasm. It's nothing you can stifle, it just kind of comes up. And then finally, you become what I refer to as a customer advocate. You are no longer selling, you are just helping. And that's the most powerful position in sales. So if you want to get in the lifeboat and stay in the lifeboat, if you want your staff to get in the lifeboat and stay in the lifeboat, develop 1 or 2 good client attraction stories and share them as often as you can. It'll remind you of your value and keep you in the lifeboat. My website I just launched has several resources that are free that you'll enjoy. One of them, I have a free e-report called 3 Simple Steps for Creating Stories that Attract More Clients. So feel free to visit my website, www.billwhitley.com. I've also got an e-zine that's packed with tips and suggestions on how to implement these ideas in your agency. And that takes us to secret number 3. Secret number 3 is how you make money with secret number 1 and secret number 2. Secret number 3 is that the top performing agents and their team members have something I refer to as a client attraction conversation. So let me ask you guys something. How many times per week does someone say to you, "What do you do?" You know, maybe you're on the side of a soccer field, you're at the PTA meeting, you're at a cocktail party, and somebody says, "What do you do?" When I ask agents that question, the average response is about 5 times per week. When I ask team members and staff members that question, the average response is 2 to 3 times per week. So if you're asked that question, let's suppose it's you and 3 staff members. If you're asked that question 5 times a week, we'll give you a couple weeks off for vacation. Let's say there's 50 weeks left in the year. It means you're being asked that question 250 times a year. Your staff, if you have 3 of them, and they're asked that question 2 times per week, that's 100 per staff member, so that's another 300. So 550 times per year, somebody says, "What do you do?" Now, if I meet Doug, I mentioned Doug earlier, if I met Doug on the side of a soccer field and I said, "So Doug, what do you do?" I'd like you to think for a second how you'd answer that question. What's the most popular response to that question if you're an insurance agent? I know it's on the top of your mind, and the most popular response when I'm doing a seminar, people yell out, "I sell insurance." Second most popular response, "I'm an insurance agent." Now, those are very accurate, and I think that's good that they're so accurate. The only problem is, it is very likely that I already have insurance. You know, by law, I can't drive a car without auto insurance. I can't have a mortgage without homeowner's insurance. So it's like a 99.9% chance that I've already got what you offer. So I'm going to commoditize you. You may be the best risk manager in America, and I may be dealing with the most pathetic quoter, but I'm never going to know how good you are if you say, I sell insurance. I'm going to say, oh, that's great. Tell me about your kids. Where do you live? You know, we're going to have a nice conversation. I'm just not going to dive into the insurance much more. I think I already have what you sell. So then along came the concept of an elevator speech. And I always ask my audiences, how long should a good elevator speech be? And somebody always yells out 30 seconds. So now let's suppose I meet Doug on the side of a soccer field. And I say, Doug, what do you do? He'd be talking. If he's going to deliver a 30-second elevator, okay, 5 seconds. Way to go, Doug. You're a sixth of the way there. Keep it going. All right, 10 seconds. You're a third of the way there. Keep talking. 15 seconds. Way to go. You're halfway there. All right, keep it going. Come on, a little more. 20 seconds, 2/3 the way. Come on, now you're coming down the home path. All right, 25 seconds. All right, okay, keep it going. 30 seconds. Now, my only point is that when you meet someone new, 30 seconds is an eternity. Here's the other interesting thing that I've noticed. I've never heard one. I have never been on the side of a soccer field or at a PTA meeting or at a cocktail party and asked someone, what do you do? I've never heard a 30-second elevator speech. I think it would sound crazy, you know, for me to say, what do you do? And then hear a 30-second speech. In the real world, nobody makes a speech. In the real world, we have conversations. I say something to you, and you say something to me, and it goes back and forth. And I call this an attraction conversation. So let's flip it around. Let's suppose Doug meets me on the side of a soccer field, and he says, so Bill, what do you do? I'd simply say, I help people manage everyday risk. And I wouldn't say another word. Now, nobody knows what everyday risk is, so there's only one possible response to that. And that's, huh? Or, what do you mean? And I'd say, oh, well, I'm an insurance agent. But what I really do is help people avoid the two biggest financial mistakes that most people make. And I wouldn't say another word. And I think it's very likely that Doug's going to lean in and go, well, what are they? And I'd say, oh, the biggest mistake is just not protecting against everyday risk. It happens all the time. You know, for example, one of my clients is a college professor. He's a nice guy. He's a smart guy. And if Doug has asked me question 1 and question 2 and question 3, I now feel like I have permission to share an example of what a good risk manager does. Now, a little bit more about this conversation. That first comment up there, I help people manage everyday risk. If there's any elevator speech, that's it. But it's not 30 seconds long. It's 2 or 3 seconds long. It would be possible to, in a very natural tone, having a conversation with somebody, they say, what do you do? I help people manage everyday risk. If that's too long for you, you could say, I help people manage risk. If that's too long for you, you could say, I'm a risk manager. It would be possible to deliver a 2 to 3 second long elevator speech. And that little elevator speech is known as a wow line. And the only purpose of a wow line is for your customer to kind of lean in and go, huh? And when they lean in and say, huh, it gives you the opportunity to share a little bit more. And that second comment is known as a how line. Now, the how line is 6 or 7 seconds long. We're not going to give it all away, but we're going to get closer to what you do. And I'm all about transparency. So very quickly, I'm an insurance agent, or I'm with, whichever carrier you're with, the name of your firm. I'm with so-and-so, but what I really do is help people avoid the 2 biggest financial mistakes that most people make. And I think it's very likely that your prospect will then ask question number 3, well, what are those? And now it's very conversational and normal to share an example of what a good risk manager does and how a good risk manager would help his or her client avoid everyday risk. So the third thing that I suggest you master is your client attraction conversation. So there's 8 secrets. As I mentioned, we don't have time to cover all 8 today, but some of the other ones are so exciting. I hope I have the opportunity to share those with you as well. Secret number 4 is how the top performing agents make discovery this simple, visual conversation. They make everyday risk so easy to understand, and I've created a little diagram that I call Your World. It'll help you educate clients about their income, their family, their assets, and everyday risks and how to protect their world. I've also, there is tips on how to coach your team. At the top agencies, they constantly coach their team and they position themselves as thought leaders and they focus on a niche and the way they create a referral-rich environment. So I hope you have the opportunities to learn some of these other secrets. As I mentioned earlier, I have a team training kit. It's on my website. Take a look at it. I also want to mention that I would love to hear from you. If you have any questions, any thoughts about how to implement these ideas, feel free to email me. I'm bill@billwhitley.com. So my goal today was to come and share some of the conversations and comments and questions that your top agencies use to transition from quoting home and auto to advising their clients in the most holistic way. And my hope is that you guys will practice and master these conversations. Listen to them in your car, share them with your team, practice them over and over and over. And my hope is that you'll make that exact same transition from quoting home and auto to advising clients. And when you make that transition, what you're going to see is that you close a lot more sales and you develop a deeper, longer-lasting relationship with your clients. So thank you for allowing me to share these ideas with you. I look forward to hearing from you soon.
Thank you for participating in this program. For more information regarding products, programs, services, and other NAIFA member benefits, visit www.naifa.org.